Exactly 530 years ago, in October 1492, the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas off the coast of the American continent. Hello. Today, while 1492 is known as the year America was discovered, Christopher Columbus is considered the explorer of America. However, stories from Indian epics dating back to the 13th century suggest that Scandinavians reached America about 5 years before the Spanish exploration expeditions. Additionally, ongoing archaeological studies today provide evidence of Vikings' presence in North America. So, we are faced with a question of why Christopher Columbus is narrated as the discoverer of America today. Considering these aspects, we will try to find the answer to this question before the end of the video. Firstly, let's dive into the dusty pages of Viking sagas and attempt to systematically explore the fascinating stories about North Atlantic expeditions. In fact, the history of European travels to America extends back to about a year before Christopher Columbus's voyages, approximately 550 years ago. The earliest recorded of these travels is found in a medieval document titled Navigation Santim Randonnae Abatis, or The Journey of St. Brown, dating back to the Middle Ages. About 300 years before the Viking North Atlantic discoveries, St. Brown and Irish monks set sail westward in search of the useless islands they believed to be in the Atlantic. When the monks reached the Faroe Islands and Iceland during their journeys, it is widely accepted today. However, it is impossible to determine the accuracy of the part of the story that extends to the shores of North America. We skip real details like icebergs, volcanoes, and whales in the book. The remaining details seem lost among the lines adorned with the saints' boundless imagination. After these journeys of splendor, Irish monks visited the Faroe Islands and Iceland several times for retreat, but did not feel the need to establish a permanent settlement because they came in groups composed entirely of men. The newcomers who would settle here for the first time were Viking groups of Scandinavian origin, Vikings who began raiding Britain from the late 8th century. In the early 9th century, Vikings established contact with Irish varieties and learned that there were other islands suitable for settlement in the west. In his work written in 825, the Snake Branch Monastery describes that the Vikings first settled in the Faroe Islands. Scandinavians gave the name Sheep Islands to these islands because they were full of sheep brought by the monks for food. The next stop for these Vikings in the North Atlantic was Iceland. Around 860, a Viking ship named Gardar, sailing from Denmark for marriages, was caught in a storm and drifted to an unknown land. With its high cliffs and ice-covered soil, this land did not seem attractive at first, but the weather conditions were not suitable for returning. Therefore, along with his small crew, Gardar landed on the northern coast of the island, exploring this newly discovered piece of land for a few months. When they set sail again in the spring, they left a slave and a servant they had brought with them on the island. These became the first inhabitants of Iceland. Another Viking who managed to reach Iceland during these months was the explorer Nadator. Nadator, named after a snowstorm in the middle of which he landed, was the one who named the island. However, the one who would give the island its real name was the Norwegian Floki. After meeting him during his stubborn Scandinavian journey and being influenced by the stories he told, when he reached Iceland, the experience here did not go as he had imagined. Floki chose the area where today's Greifjord town is located as a settlement. He spent his first summer on the island by fishing for lumpfish, but all the animals he brought with him died of hunger because he could not provide enough food. After this development, he decided to return, but he was stranded on the island because the fjords that opened to the sea were covered with ice. Due to all these experiences, Floki named it Iceland. This word, which comes from the Old Norse language, has passed into other languages over time and has become Iceland in Turkish. Around 874, a group led by Ingolfur Arnarsson left Norway under the leadership of King Harald Fairhair, who had problems in the first quarter of the 10th century, and came to Iceland with their wives and children, succeeding in establishing a settlement. By the mid-10th century, the population in Iceland had reached several thousand. However, the discovery of Iceland had become a matter of time for the Romans as well. In the first quarter of the 10th century, a seafarer named Gunnbjörn Ulfsson disappeared when he sailed from Norway to Iceland, caught in a storm, and the giant glacier-covered Mission Island drifted to the west of Iceland. He hoped that this land, which he did not get to see in his eyes and which he believed was in the Atlantic, would return to Iceland without landing. Shortly after this incident, a new group came with the aim of settling in Islam. One of the members of this group, Erik Thorlak, who was still a small child in those years, would later be called Erik the Red because of his long red hair and red beard. Erik's father had been sent into exile for committing murder and had moved to Iceland with his family, including small Erik. However, all the fertile lands on the island had been seized by settlers who had arrived in the region before. In order to have better lands, he had been involved in many fights, and in the end, he had been expelled from Iceland in 982 by killing someone. He had to leave the country for at least 3 years, and it was best to sail westward, explore the lands discovered by Gunn years ago, and investigate whether settlement could be established there. Thus, he set sail with a few men he took with him, starting to progress in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Firstly, I felt a sense of pride. Erik, who reached the southern tip, later turned northward and explored the west coast of this land. There were no traces of life in the glacial deserts. They only encountered a few stomachs and remnants of decayed boats. These were probably remnants of the Eskimos who were believed to have abandoned the region about a century ago. Erik explored Greenland for 3 years, and by the end of the 3rd year, he had died, completing his exile period and returning to Iceland. In fact, these lands were not suitable for living, but to evoke excitement in people from both new discoveries, he named it Reyar, meaning green place. The stories he told claimed that the newest piece of land he found was filled with lush green trees. Soon, hundreds of people planning to go there had gathered around him. When Leif set sail again, this time there were 25 ships accompanying him. However, only 14 of them managed to safely land. The rest either returned or were lost in the dark waters of the Atlantic. The number of people reaching the shore with this expedition exceeded 400. Although some of them returned to Iceland, it was possible to establish 2 different settlements with those who stayed here. The eastern settlement located in the southern part of the island and the western settlement located further north. This situation never made Greenland an attractive settlement for the Vikings, not even as appealing as Iceland. In contrast, those descended from Red Erik continued to live in Greenland until the 15th century. As a result of archaeological excavations conducted in the 20th century, the remains of a longhouse, a smithy, and a church left by the Vikings were unearthed. This information was learned by a native who came to Iceland in 986, about 4 years after the discovery. Each year, he learned that his father had left his land there, sailing with Red Erik to the newly discovered lands. Assembling a native intervention team, he set sail again to find his father and other relatives who went with Erik. However, none of them had been to Greenland before, and they had nothing but a few legendary stories told by Erik in Iceland. However, the journey turned out to be much more challenging than they expected. A native and 21 others set sail, and shortly after leaving, the sky was covered with dark clouds, and a violent storm erupted, tossing the ships from one place to another. After this 3-day storm, a native noticed that the first thing the men saw was a piece of land barely visible through the dispersing black clouds. A native moved along the coast to the north and decided not to land here because he thought the land was worthless. Also, there was no trace of the new settlement established by the house. After a journey that lasted for several days, a native finally landed in Greenland and managed to reach his father's farm in the eastern settlement. The discovery of the new lands in the southwest did not attract much attention at first, but around a year later, Red Erik, inspired by the stories of the other, decided to make an exploratory journey here. However, he was too old to endure this laborious and long journey himself. Therefore, his son Leif assigned him as the leader of the discovery expedition. Preparations were completed, and in the summer months of a year, the Vikings set sail towards the lands discovered by the revelation with a team of 35 people. The first place they landed was today's Baffin Island. The Vikings named this place Helleland, meaning land of stones, because it was icy and barren everywhere. However, Leif thought that waking up here would be a waste of time. Apparently, they encountered infertile lands everywhere. So they boarded their ships again and started moving southward. In succession, they reached a place called Markland, meaning land of trees, and Windhand, meaning land of wine. Martin was present-day Labrador, but where exactly this place was is still unclear. In contrast, historians believe, considering the geography of the region, that this could be places like Vinland or Lance Aux Meadows today. The Vikings landed in this place they named and built a few houses to spend the winter. However, it was not a permanent settlement, and when spring came, they returned to Greenland and continued their exploration movement. This journey ensured that they were the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent. In Torbali, they were the first Europeans to encounter Native Americans. However, this encounter did not go very friendly. The Vikings killed a few Native Americans where they landed, and others, in turn, fatally wounded the Vikings by attacking them. This development marked the end of the Vikings' second discovery expedition. A few years after his venture in Torbali, a group of settlers led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, Talfi's brother, set out to establish a permanent settlement on the American continent. However, this initiative did not go smoothly due to conflicts with the Native Americans and other difficulties during the winter months. The first winter Thorfinn and his companions spent in Zindan went quite peacefully. They communicated with the Native Americans in the region and even started fur trading among themselves. However, over time, disagreements arose between the two groups. When Torpil's men killed a group of natives on the pretext of trying to steal swords, others returned to take revenge. The Vikings managed to repel the Native Americans by setting up an ambush. However, they realized that they could not stay here for a long time. Together with the Tofin family, they found a safe place the next year and finally settled by buying some land in Iceland. A few years later, the last settlement attempt by Leif Eriksson and his sister Frydis failed. From that moment on, interest in the Greenlandic link waned. Later, the fate of the journeys to North America made by a few adventurers is not certain. Almost all of what we have mentioned so far comes from two epics written from the 13th century onwards: the Pride Memories epic and the Red Erik epic. This situation suggests the possibility that the entire story may have been fabricated. In fact, historians, considering this possibility, thought for a long time that the Vikings' travels might not be real. Until 1960, when traces of the Vikings were found in the Nisqually Valley on the west coast of North America. In 1960, thanks to the efforts of two Norwegian researchers, a Viking settlement was unearthed at the northern end of humanity. As a result of excavations conducted by archaeologists in the region, remnants of 7 longhouses belonging to the Vikings were found near a small village, the foundations of which were joke, flour, and some covered with cellars in Iceland. Various workshops were found around the settlement. All the materials found bore the traces of Viking craftsmanship. It is now an undeniable fact that the Vikings reached America 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So, why do we still claim today that America was discovered by Christopher Columbus? Is this misinformation? Actually, if you think about it, it's not. It might be a bit of a cliché statement, but Columbus was the first, not the first but the last, discoverer of America. Like the Vikings, there were other civilizations thought to have reached America before Columbus. However, pre-Columbian discoveries all fell victim to the cruelty of time and never permanently engraved in human memory. They were only told in stories and epics, often forgotten. But Columbus's discovery was permanent. Since that day, a vast continent beyond the Atlantic Ocean has never been forgotten. New settlements were established on this continent, and some of them survived until today. This is why today we accept Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America. But this does not overshadow the voyages of the Vikings. On the contrary, these voyages tell us an incredible success story of the Vikings using the islands in the North Atlantic as a springboard to reach America 5 years before Columbus. Considering how limited their means and technology were compared to 500 years later, the value and importance of these achievements become even more understandable.